Hello and welcome to Class 3 in Maya 312. This is still the part of the course where we're working on our creature lighting. It's also the part of the course where we're going to be working with our live action HDRs of the candle flames as well. So just before we begin, just like we did in the previous class, and you might have to just revert back to Class 1 if you haven't already got this set up, but just double check that you're using the correct color management for this course, which is the ACES OCIO 1.0.3 config. That's going to be really important, especially from this point on. So if you haven't got that set up already, I would encourage you to go back to Class 1 and make sure that that's all squared away. If we just remind ourselves of what's in this scene here, jump over to the perspective camera. We've got our kind of crazy scene set up here already, and if you remember from the last class, the only kind of light that we've got in here, which really isn't doing that much lighting, is the environment. This is the sky dome that we're using for the environmental effects in here, the sort of reflections and refractions and stuff like that. And then we've got our candles. So I want to talk a little bit about what our goals are for this class. The first part of this class, I'm going to talk to you about how I captured the live action HDRs and what sort of equipment I used and what kind of settings we used, that kind of thing. Just a little bit of the theory there. Then we're going to have a look at preparing the candle flame HDR. I also want to take this class as an opportunity to create the LED HDR maps that are going to go onto these little LED spots here, and they're going to be throwing some light up into the scene and creating some nice atmospheric thing. So that's the goal for this class. So the first thing that I want to do is show a couple of slides. So the first slide that I want to show you is of the camera that we use for this course. Now this is a Sony A-series camera. It's an A7S II. It's a wonderful camera. I use it for all sorts of things, but it's particularly great for shooting live action HDRs. It has a full frame sensor and it shoots in 4K, so there's plenty of resolution for us to play with, really high resolution images. But also, importantly, it shoots in log. It shoots in S-Log3. Now the importance of S-Log3 is it retains a lot more color information than if you were to shoot with a normal video camera which shoots in something like Rec. 709. We'll talk about that in just a second. Now the next slide that I want to show you, which admittedly is actually a video file, is straight out of the camera. This is the video file that we're going to be using for our live action HDR. So I'm just going to play through a few frames so you can see this. Okay, so there's a lot of frames in here. It's quite a long sequence and we will only end up using a section of it. But what's important about this candle is it was shot at 4K and it was shot using the Sony Log3 profile. So what does all this mean? Well, on the left-hand side here, we've got the Sony S-Log3 profile, and on the right-hand side, we've got the Rec. 709 color space. Now, normal video cameras or consumer video cameras will typically shoot in Rec. 709, but the Sony, the A7S II, can shoot in Sony S-Log3. There's an S-Log3 profile. And the major difference between these two images is that in the image on the right, the Rec. 709 color space, we're losing all of the highlight information. You can see from the sky is completely blown out. You can see the white color of the windows up there is lost as well. And if you have a look at the chrome ball, the sun is in the top right hand corner. It's completely vanished. It's completely blown out. Now, if you were to gain down this image, none of that information would be recovered. There's virtually nothing more in this image than what you can see. Whereas in the S-Log3 profile, the image on the left-hand side, we're retaining all of this highlight information. So when we come to light with a linear EXR, all of that information will contribute to our lighting and we'll get a much more accurate result. Okay, so here we are in Nuke, and just before we begin, we're going to make sure that our color management is set up correctly again. This is the last time in this course that we'll go over this. If you missed this in the first class, you should go back and take a look at it. But remember that we're working with the ACES workflow. So I'm just going to tap S on the keyboard, come up to color, go over to Nuke, OCIO, ACES 1.0.3, and close out the properties panel. All right, that's great. We also want to make sure that our viewer is set to Rec 709 Aces. So we're all ready to go. I'm going to tap R on the keyboard to create a read node. And inside the class 3 folder in source images, we've got this clip C0023MP4. Now this is straight out of the camera. We haven't done anything to this. It's not been chopped down. It's quite a big file size, 425 megabytes. So there's quite a lot of data in there. So let's load that in. And right off the bat, we're getting an error. So let's just hit 1 on the keyboard with this selected to read that error. All right, so it's saying we've got an invalid LUT selected, gamma 2.2. Now that's absolutely fine. We're not using gamma 2.2. We're actually going to come down to the color space, drop down underneath color spaces, come all the way over to input. And we've got all of these cameras listed here, Arri, Canon, some generic cameras, GoPro. We've got Panasonic, Red, and right down the bottom we've got Sony. This is the one that we're looking for. Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut3 Cine. Now the picture profiles in the Sony camera, you have the option choose S-Log3 and S-Log3 Cine. So the reason why we use Cine as part of the picture profile is I feel like it captures the warmth of the candlelight quite nicely. All right, so the first thing that we can see is we've got quite a lot of frames here. There's 1600, so it's quite a long video. We're certainly not going to need 1600 frames. Our render scene actually only has a 50 frame camera move in it. So if we go back and check that, we scrub through the timeline. Yeah, we've only got 50 frames, so we certainly don't need 1600 frames of candlelight. So one thing we'll do is we'll cut that down. Let's go back to Nuke. And also the resolution of 4K with all of this black area around the outside. Now, that's not going to be very useful to us. So if you remember from the first class, we had to reformat the image to fit inside a square area light. That's something that we're going to have to do here as well. The only difference is that this is a moving image sequence as opposed to a still. But again, we're going to have to reformat this to a square. So I think maybe the first job to do is pick out, let's say, 100 frames of this candle that are looking quite interesting. And the reason why we want to pick out more than 50 frames, given that 50 frames is the amount that's in our Maya timeline, is that on the different candles, we can put in an expression. So all of the motion in the candle is different on each candle flame. Even if it's just by a few frames, it'll make a real difference. Okay, so let's pick out a nice range. Now, something that I've already identified is between frame 300 and 400, there's a nice combination of waving candle flame and also the candle being at rest. Yeah, we don't want our scene to be too crazy with lots of candles flickering all over the place. So this range is a nice mixture. But if you have this video and you've downloaded the resources for this course, feel free to choose whatever section you want of this. You can also choose to use more or less of it if you want to, depending on how you've got your scene set up. But we're going to take frame 300 to frame 400. So let's come down to the node graph. I'm going to hit Tab on the keyboard, and we're going to make a frame range node. All right, so this is going to help us keep it nice and tidy. Frame 300 to frame 400. Let's quickly jump back over to Maya. Our timeline in Maya is starting from 1001 and it's ending at 1050. So we're going to want a few frames before 1001, so we don't want to start our candle image sequence at frame 1001. We want to start it at probably something like 980 to allow a little bit of pre-roll. So let's go back over to Nuke. Let's put down a time offset node. So again, just hitting Tab on the keyboard and typing a time offset to bring this up. And I'm going to put in negative 320. I'm going to put down another time offset node and put in plus 1000. So now when we switch from global to input, our first frame is 980. And our last frame is 1080. All right, so I also just want to set a little project setting here. So let's tap S on the keyboard and let's come to FPS and change this to 25. And let's change our full size format to match the plate as well. So we're at UHD 4K. This was shot at 4K. And I'm going to lock the range 980 to 1080. All right, so when we come down and switch from input to global, we've got our frame range 980 to 1080 set in there. So let's close out the properties. Now, the keen-eyed amongst you will have seen that our candle is upside down. And the reason why the candle is upside down is it was just a lot easier to film it this way. By inverting the camera on the camera rig, it gave a better view of the screen so we could all see what was going on. So that's the reason why the candle is upside down. It's for no particular technical or scientific reason. It's just because it was easier to see on the day. So let's mirror this. I'm going to drop down a mirror node, again by hitting tab on the keyboard. Flip vertical, flip horizontal. All right. So the next thing to do, just like we did in the first class, is we need to turn this into a square. So I'm going to drop down a crop node, and we're going to just crop the candle itself, the actual lit area. We don't need all of this stuff around the outside. That's not really what we're after. We're just after the light information in our candle flame. So hitting tab on the keyboard, dropping down a crop node. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Okay, and I'm just going to start bringing in the edges of my crop node. It's good to just check through a few frames here and make sure that the candle is not going to go outside of this. Maybe let's give it a little bit of breathing room. Just expand it out a little bit. Having a little bit of this extraneous information here is not going to do us any harm. So let's pull this in as well. And pull up the bottom. Now we know that the candle is not going to go any lower than the wick, so let's pull this all the way up to here. And then on the top, I think the candle only ever reaches really as far as this. So that's a good framing. So let's hit reformat. And you can see from that 4K frame, we're actually only retaining 840 by 964 pixels of this. Now the fact that this isn't square probably isn't going to be too much of a problem for this class, but it's good working practice to make your HDR flags square. So let's go ahead and do that, and we want to make it then 840 by 840. So I'm going to drop down a reformat node. I'm going to go to output format and new. And we're going to call this candle. And our file size is 840 by 840. Make sure your pixel aspect is set to 1, hit OK. All right, and now we're actually going to distort the image. So this is squashing our candle into a square, which is absolutely fine because when we apply it to our area lights inside of Maya, just like we did in the first class, we can distort the area light itself to make the candle flame the right shape. Okay, so this is looking really good. Let's dive in and take a look at some of the color information that we have here. So I'm going to switch over to the spot meter, and in the viewer I'm just going to tap S on the keyboard, and where it says center f-stop I'm going to change that to 0. And that's going to allow us to sample in EV. Before it was set to 8, and it's showing us in stops, but we want to have a look at this in EV, so let's set that to 0. All right, so now we can see this in EV. EV means exposure value, and it's just a great sort of universal format for having a look at exposures. I quite like to use it. Okay, so let's close out those properties. So I'm going to gain up, and we're just going to have a look at the black areas of this image. So it's a little bit noisy back there, but that's okay. We're probably not going to see that in our lighting. The only thing that we need to watch out for is any sort of strange values. Now, as I'm moving my mouse over here, I'm seeing a little negative value come into the greens and stuff like that. So we don't really want that. So let's just bear that in mind. We're going to deal with that in just a second. But if we gain down, we can see that we've got plenty of dynamic range in this candle. And if I move my cursor over the flame, there's values in here as high as 13 or 14 in the reds. And if I sample an area, our EV is actually 6.1, which is loads of information to light with. So let's deselect that. Okay, so to take a slightly closer look at the values that we've got inside of our candle flame here, we want to try and find the maximum luma value and the minimum luma value of our candle flame and the surrounding area. And the reason why we want to do that is to check for things like negative values, and we also want to check for crazy high values as well. So the best way to do that is to drop down a curve tool node. So with our reformat selected, I'm going to tap Tab on the keyboard. I'm going to put down a curve tool. And the curve tool is not a roto shape or anything like that. It's a different type of tool. And we're going to use this to measure our max and min luma values. So something I like to do with the curve tool is just drop in a frame hold. I'm going to hold that frame on the frame that we were looking at, which is 1006. That way we're always going to be working on just this frame. Now there's a lot more frames obviously in the timeline, but this is a good example frame for us to use because the flame is full and it's pretty typical of the other frames. So let's come down to the curve tool once again. And from curve type, I'm going to switch this from average intensities to max luma pixel, and I'm going to hit go. It gives us the option to define a frame range, and 1006 is already in here. If yours is displayed as something else, because we've got a frame hold in here, you can sample any of the frames in the timeline. It doesn't matter, it'll still give us this frame that's frame held on 1006 because it thinks all the frames are the same. So as good housekeeping, I'm going to keep frame 1006 in here and press OK. All right, so the curve tool has analyzed this frame. All we need to do now is go over to the Max Luma Data tab, and it shows us what we've got. So we've got this little spot down here, and that's telling us what our max luma data is, and this little spot up here, which is telling us what our min luma data is. So it's just sampling the pixels and telling us what our max and min is. So maximum's great. There's values in here above 15, so there's loads of information there for us to light with. There's plenty of dynamic range in this image, or in this image sequence, so that's going to work out really nicely for us. The thing we don't want is the minimum luminance pixel value is below 0. Now all this is very easily solved. It's just something you have to keep an eye on when you're working with this type of live action HDRs. You don't really want negative values in here. Sometimes with the maximum as well, you might have things like lens flares or some little pings or reflections or something. If the camera's moving quite a lot, the subject's moving a little bit, you might get some extraneous, very high values that might give you some strange lighting rendering results inside of Maya. So you want to try and find like a decent range, and I think that something around 15, if we actually put our maximum luminance pixel value up to something like 20, it'll allow for some frames which are a little bit brighter as well without clamping, but we definitely don't want this negative value. So I'm going to come down here, and between the frame hold and the curve tool, I'm going to drop in a clamp. So tab on the keyboard, clamp. Okay, so you can see straight away that all of the dynamic range in our image has been knocked out. If I sample it, we've got 111, it's clamped to a maximum of 1. We've got two sliders in the top of the clamp node that are enabled, min and maximum, and the maximum is clamped at 1. So I'm just going to deselect that sample. So default minimum is set to 0. That's great because we don't want these negative luminance values creeping in there. Maximum is set to 1, but we want to set this to something like 20. And this is going to restore our dynamic range for this frame, but it's also going to restore our dynamic range for the other frames and allow them to go as high as 20. I don't think we're going to have any values in here that go above 20, so that's a good number for us. So let's come back down to the curve tool. Click on the curve tool tab. Max Luma pixel is already selected. Hit go. And then we've got frame 1006 already selected in here, but again, you can use any frame from the timeline because we've got that frame hold set to 1006. So let's hit OK. All right, let's jump back to Max Luma data. And we can see that we've got a minimum of 000, which is great. There's no negative values in here, which is really good. And then in the max luminance pixel value, we're allowing it to go as high as 20, so ours falls well within that range, and our maximum value here is actually 15.6. Okay, so we can delete the curve tool, but we want to keep the clamp, so make sure we don't delete the clamp. Zoom out a little bit so we can see what's going on. And all that's left to do now is write out this sequence. So to do that, I'm going to drop down a write node, come down to clamp, tab, write node. So channels RGB is fine. We don't want RGBA or anything like that because there's no alpha channel in here. And for the rest of the settings, we need to define a file. So I'm going to click on the file icon. The source images directory from this Maya project is absolutely fine, but let's create a new folder. I'm going to call this folder flame underscore HDR underscore V001. Hit enter. I like to keep my HDR image sequences in separate version folders, just because it makes it a little bit easier for me to organize. I'm going to copy the folder name, which is flame HDR V001, the one that we just created. I'm going to paste that in here as well. This is going to become our file name. Okay, so I'm going to put .hash.exr, and this is going to give us a 1 frame padding EXR sequence. So I'm going to hit save. It's not going to save the images right away. If you're unfamiliar with Nuke, it's just going to create the file path for us. Bit of housekeeping before we hit render. I'm going to go up to File, and let's save this comp. So save comp. And I've created a Nuke folder for this class, and we'll give this the same name. So I've got the name of that file already in the clipboard here, so I'm just going to paste that in. And we're going to name the comp the same as the file that we're writing out, so flame HDR V001, and hit save. All right, great. So if we need to come back to this, we've got the file saved as a Nuke script. So this file came in as slog. It's going to go out in a different format. And the color space by default is scene linear. So we're actually just going to keep it scene linear. And we're going to write it as an ACES compliant EXR. And because we want an image sequence here, our frame hold node, we're just going to delete that. That's going to allow us to write out the whole sequence. All right, so let's tap render. It's picking up the global frames, which is 980 to 1080, which is fine. We set that using our frame range node, and this is going to give us some pre-roll and then a little bit at the tail, so we can use an expression in our image nodes in Maya to offset the candle flame and gives a bit of variation. So that's why we've got that like this. So let's just hit OK, and it's going to render out the sequence for us. Okay, and let's check the result. So I'm going to create a read node, tap R on the keyboard. The last directory we were in is right here, which is our EXR directory for the live action HDR we just wrote out. So let's hit open, tap 1 on the keyboard to view that. And we can see that we've got our image sequence, and this is looking really good. Plenty of range in here, which is fantastic. And this is ready to go. So let's copy this EXR path. Control A, Control C on the keyboard. And let's head back to Maya. Okay, so here inside Maya, we're going to bring that image sequence into Maya, just so we've got it in a handy location for us to use in the next class. And then we're going to prepare the LED lights for the top of his helmet. So let's go up to the hypershade. And I'm going to clear this out from all the old stuff that we had in there from the last class. Come down to the node graph area, tab on the keyboard, and create a file node, so file texture. Let's go to the image name, and paste that path into the file name. Just going to take the file name out of the file path, hit enter on the keyboard. And that's going to take us to our flame live action HDR image sequence. I'm going to select the frame up at the top here, but it could be any of these frames. It could be some of these frames down here as well. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to hit open. All right, great. So let's just rename this file node so it's easy for us to find. And let's do flame underscore HDR underscore image. All right, so when we come over to our textures tab, we'll be able to find that nice and easily from our top left-hand corner here. All right, so we're going to park the flame for now, and we're going to take a look at our LED. We'll return to our flame and getting those lights set up in the next class. So I'm going to jump over to my file browser quickly. Okay, so inside of our class 3 Maya folder, if you come to source images, this is where we had our clip. It's also where we're storing the lat long of our room, and it's where we just wrote out our flame HDR to as well. There's a folder in here called LED, so let's dive inside there. And there's a folder here called RAW, so let's go in there. Okay, so in this folder we've got 5 raw file images. And these are raw files from the Sony camera, so these are still images, raw still images from the Sony camera. If you cast your mind back to the first class in this course, you'll remember that we took a look at 5 images that I had already turned into a HDR EXR image. We then went on to use that HDR, it was of a tube light, to do some lighting effects on our zombie pickup truck. The difference between these images and the images in the first class is that these are raw images and they've not yet been converted to TIFFs and they've not yet been turned into a HDR. So at this point in the class, I'm going to show you quickly how to do that. So these are Sony RAW ARW files. It's just Sony's RAW format, and we want to convert these to TIFFs before we convert them to a HDR image. The software that I like to use for this is called RAW Therapy. If I jump over to my browser, here's the website for it. It's spelt like this, RAW Therapy. And it's a great piece of software for handling raw images, and it's something that I really like to use. It's available on Linux, Mac, and Windows. So feel free to have a play with this at your leisure or use it for this course. I'm going to go back to my desktop and open that up. So this is it, RAW Therapy. In the top left-hand corner, you've got the File Browser tab, you've got the Queue, and you've got the Editor. They're the 3 main modes inside of RAW Therapy. You open your files using the File Browser, you edit them, and then you put them in the render queue to export them. So I've navigated to our RAW folder here, so I'm just going to close this over a little bit. So there's some interesting metadata written underneath these RAW files. All the way over at the end here, we've got 1/8000th of a second exposure, which is the darkest image. So in our image bracket, we go from dark to light. So 1/8000th is our fastest shutter speed. 1000 is the one next to that. 125th is the one in the middle. That's our middle exposure. And then we've got 15th of a second, and then we've got a half second. This being our brightest image. So 5 images is enough for this bracket, because with the Sony RAW files, there's enough color data in each one of these RAW files to overlap with the one next to it, at least a little bit anyway, which means that we're going to end up with a really nice HDR when all of this is put together. So I'm going to apply our edits to this middle exposure, and I'm going to copy those edits to the other images in the bracket before we export them. So let's double click on this one. It might just take a second to load, but it opens up in our editor here. So I'm going to zoom in. There's a little magnifying glass down here in the bottom right hand corner. And it looks pixelated, but that's okay. It's just rendering the frame. And this is what's going to make up the little spotlights on the top of our astronaut's helmet. If I move that into the center, we've got a clearer view of what we're looking at here. We're not going to do too much to it. All that we want to do is try and get as much information out of these images as possible. Crop them and export them. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a crop. So the crop tool's here on the toolbar, and we've got this locked in the aspect ratio. So I'm just going to drag that around our bulb. And I'm going to change our lock ratio to 1:1. And this will create a square for us. And we can just drag down the corners and try and crop out as much of this image that we don't need. Okay, great. Next thing that we want to do is select a color temperature for these lights. So over in the color tab, we have the option to change the white balance. So at the moment, for a white or blue light, this is obviously far too warm at the moment. So we can adjust our temperature by sliding the temperature slider. And let's make it something like 2500. Okay, so this is a more kind of like white or blue style light. Okay, so that's pretty good. Just going to scroll down. And under the working profile, I'm going to switch to wide gamut. And under output profile, by default, I have mine set to RT version 4 wide. So I'm just going to leave that on. And I'm going to uncheck black point compression. Okay, great. So I'm going to go back to the file browser. On the middle exposure, the image that we have just made the edits to, I'm going to right click, come down to processing profile operations, hit copy. I'm going to select the other images, either side, right click, processing profile operations, and hit paste. Okay, so we can see that the adjustments we've made to our center image have now been applied to the others. I'm going to select all of these, right click, and hit put to queue. In the queue, we've got 5 images, so let's click on that. Those images are here in our render queue. So the first thing we want to do is hit save to folder and navigate through to your LED folder in the source images directory. This is where I'm choosing to save the images to. I'm going to create a folder called TIFF, hit create, and I'm going to hit open. Now, the file format that you want, by default, this is probably set to JPEG 8. Now, we don't want to be working with JPEGs, we want to be working with TIFFs. And we want to be working with TIFF 16-bit. We don't want to be working with floats or PNGs or anything like that. 16-bit TIFF is fine. Uncompressed TIFF is preferable. And where this little circle icon here is in queue, I'm going to press that and it's going to run the queue for us. Okay. So those images are now exported. I'm going to close down raw therapy and switch back to Nuke. Okay, so I'm going to make a read node, hitting R on the keyboard. I'm going to navigate up to our LED folder, find that TIFF folder. I'm going to turn sequences off and read these in as individual reads. So select all of those and hit open. I'm going to select them all and hit L on the keyboard so we can take a look at our bracket. Okay, so you can see that these are now in a square format, which is 158 by 158 pixels. They're cropped down, they're really small file sizes, and these are going to work really well. So the next piece of software that I want to show you is called Luminance HDR. Okay, so again, this is a free piece of software. It works really, really well for creating HDR images, and it's really simple to use, taking a bracket of images and compiling them to a HDR image. The first thing you need to do is just hit New HDR Image, and then using a little plus arrow, we're going to add in our TIFF images. And we're going to grab all of these and hit Open. So it's going to give you a little warning here about the EXIF tags. Don't worry about that, we're going to set that information manually, so just hit OK. And the first thing that we want to do over here in category 2 is define the EVs that these bracketed images were taken at. Now, if you remember back to raw therapy and the metadata underneath each one of those raw files, we know that these are taken at different exposures. And here it's expressed as EV. Now, there are actually 3 EVs apart. 1/2500th is our middle exposure and is 0 EV. But then the one after that should be plus 3 EV, and then the one after that plus 6 EV. It's a 5 image bracket, 3 EVs apart. So the first thing that we need to do is just change these. So where it says plus 2 EV here, we're going to change this to 3. And where it says plus 4, we're going to change this to 6. And where it says -2, this needs to be -3. Because it's 3 EV less than the middle exposure. And we need to change this to -6 because it's 6 EV less than the middle exposure as well. All right, so we don't need to set up any other settings in here. This is all ready to go. We're going to hit next. And all we have to do here is set a profile. Now, there's a bunch of profiles in here, and the one that's best suited for us is profile 5. And this is a Gaussian linear profile. We don't need to worry about setting up a custom configuration. For our set of images, this is going to work quite well. So we've got Show HDR Preview on down here. We're going to hit Compute. Okay, so that's looking pretty good already. Let's close that down. Let's uncheck Show HDR Preview and hit Finish. Okay, so over here on the histogram, if we move this up and down, we can check our range. So it can go from underexposed to overexposed. Okay, and the fact that we're able to recover these very, very bright values means that we've got a HDR image here. So all I'm going to do now is hit Save As, and I'm going to go up one directory to where we have our RAW and TIFF folders. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this EXR. So inside this folder, instead of having this incredibly long file name, I'm going to call this something like cool bulb underscore v001.exr. All right, let's hit save and let's close down Luminance HDR. There's no real need to save your work in here at this point. Going back to Nuke, tap R on the keyboard, navigate up to that EXR folder and read in our bulb, hit open, hit 1 on the keyboard to view that. Let's check on raw data, and if we move our gain down, we can see that we've got plenty of dynamic range in here. Okay, and if we wanted to check the color values, just like we did with the candle, we can drop down a curve tool. No need to put in a frame hold for this because it's just a single frame. Switch from average intensities to max luma pixel. Hit go. 1:1 is absolutely fine. Uncheck continue on error. Hit OK. And then head over to the max luma data tab. So we can see that we've got a maximum luminance pixel value of nearly 6 in the red channel, 6.4 in the green channel, and just over 6 in the blue channel. And unlike our candle flame, this image doesn't have any negative values, so we know that we're all set. Okay, great. Let's jump back over to Maya and we'll just load this image in so we're prepared for the next class. So still in the hypershade, I'm going to drop down a file node. That's by pressing tab on the keyboard. File texture. The image name, we're going to navigate up, find the LED folder, find the EXR folder, click on Cool Bulb, hit open, and then we're going to name this Cool Bulb underscore image. All right, great. So we've got our image file set up here ready to go. One candle image sequence, one HDR of a little spotlight bulb, and this is going to do the lighting for our little helmet bulbs back here. They're going to be a nice little cool white light, and we use the word cool as opposed to warm, the warm light of the candle and the cool light of the little spotlights in the helmet. So in this class we've prepared our live action HDR, we've also prepared the lights for the top of the helmet. In the next class we're going to start adding those lights to the scene and doing our character lighting. So I hope you've enjoyed this class, and I hope to see you in the next one.